Thanks, Elena. Welcome, everybody. Comment, which was kudos to Ellen's tolerance.
Yeah. Amen to that.
For our third treat, we're looking forward to hearing from Alan.
Okay, so as some people know, I make my art by loading photographs into a large computer program that I've created. And the program uses sets of equations. There's several thousand that I put in the program to move the pixels in the photographs around, or to use mathematics to microscopically color each pixel by transforming the colors of the pixel around it. So I often use pictures that were taken by Alana. She's a much better photographer than me. And on a layover on a trip to Israel, in the Netherlands, she hired a driver and drove around and took a number of wonderful pictures when she was a teenager. This is a karaoke cafe in Volendam, which is probably about 10 miles or so northeast of Amsterdam on the Markermeer Lake, which is the bottom of the Zuiderzee. The whole village is an antique village. It's very charming. I may have used this photo several thousand times to make art. It just keeps coming back to it. It just keeps giving and giving and giving. There are two parts to my system. One part moves the pixels around, and the other part does the microscopic colorization. And I can choose to use one or both. So I'm going to start by showing you several pieces that are just colorized. All right, so this is colorized, and each pixel is individually colorized in this. I choose the equation sets to color, and then I can put in modifications in the controls. So a single set can produce an almost endless series of different colorizations. Just to give you an idea, in my fastest sets will convert the previous image to an image like this in under 5 seconds. Here's another variation, okay? Now, in the next slide, I'm going to show you what happens when I modify the spatial structure and then afterward modify the color as well. So there you've got a surreal sort of karaoke landscape and then a rather flamboyant colorization. I can push the structure much further than that into a much more surreal place. So you can see the windows down at the bottom here. So this is the same karaoke cafe. In fact, you see Modi's name here. This was then colored, as you can see, mostly in a blue spectrum with some nice red highlights here. I then probably put this back into the colorization engine and colored it again to get a much more complex color scheme. There's special algorithms that I've written such that if a person should want this as a framed piece for their wall, and they said, well, I really like it, but I'd prefer if these blue and purple regions were variations in yellow. And so I have special algorithms where I can tell all the blue to be yellow. I don't know how many of you have visited Mike at the farm. I've probably done it 4 times. On my first visit, I took a photo of his beautiful old antique barn. And I'm glad I did, because about a year later, the health authorities came in and they said, Mr. Tabor, you're storing food in that rotting old thing. You have to put new siding on that. You can't have it near that wood. And now if you go there, there's this yellow vinyl barn, very spiffy looking, but without any of the charm of this old thing. This image, also like the karaoke cafe, just keeps giving and giving and giving. Almost every day I make images from this. I don't know why. Other images give me a headache sometimes. I mean, I have to work for hours to get a decent transformation of some images. They're more resistant, but the barn is very giving. It might surprise you, since I'm rather abstract, that Monet is my favorite painter. And this strikes me as very Monet-like. I started doing this in 2012. This series was done only a few months after I started. A slight variation of this particular image prompted me to call my dentist. I had landscaped 2 houses for him many years ago, and he's been my dentist for about 40 years. He's very wealthy. His father left him a lot of money, and he's an art collector. And so I took my computer to him, and he went into the computer and he saw these images, and he was absolutely thrilled. And right there, he bought 4 pieces from me, unframed. I mean, I had to go print them, but they were unframed and unmatted for $2,000. So, you know, that gave me the idea that I could really, really be successful as an artist, which shows you how a little luck can produce fantastic delusions. So here's the barn, and this looks like it's in the rain. It's a little less transformed in terms of its structure, but has a rather interesting colorization. I often like to push the images so that they're very surreal. And there's a characteristic that's emerged, which I didn't realize at the beginning would be a general characteristic of what I do. If I don't colorize the images, they tend to retain the aspect of being a photograph, even when they're extremely surreal, which I'll demonstrate in a minute or two. If I colorize them, they look much more like paintings. So sometimes it looks like I'm doing a painting, and sometimes it looks like I'm doing a photograph, well, maybe on another planet. This is a combination. I mean, there's been some structural movement. You've got some ghosting here. And then, of course, to me, this looks like it's taken in the Southwest. You can see the title. But next, you see a tremendous distortion in the structure of the image. And then it was heavily colorized. And, you know, it really looked to me like it was a barn being strained to its limits in a 1930s dust storm. And this is what I mean by retaining photographic quality. It really looks like I went someplace, I don't know, in Lewis Carroll's imagination and took a photograph, right? And to me, there are a number of things that are remarkable about it. The way, using complex sets of equations, you can get mixed symmetries, right? Not simply something like a Roge-Arc, not simply, you know, like symmetrical mirroring down the middle, but a series of complex mirrorings, both vertically and horizontally. It generates a really kind of amusing landscape. So in the next couple, I'm going to get even more and more surreal. So I've shrunk the barn down there. So it just surrounds a kind of strange tractor. And then in the final piece, I shrunk it even more so it turns into a totem. But sometimes I can extract a piece of the barn or some other object and then create a wholly different landscape, as you can see. This is interesting to me because it does retain the original colors. None of the pixels here have had any color transformation applied to them. But because of the way the fine elements are smeared and textured, it sort of sits in between photography and painting. As people who've known me a while, you know that when Rhonda and I had a home, or homes, I had big gardens, and I collected a lot of exotic plants. People know me, know that I grew up in the horticultural industry. In the introduction, I was described as growing up on a chicken farm, and that was true until I was 7. But then both of my parents turned many acres of the farm into the largest landscape nursery on the Jersey coast. And very early on, when I was in elementary school, I fell in love with gardening, living with their gardens. They maintained big gardens. And that stayed with me the rest of my life. I spent this morning planting a whole bunch of cactus on my balcony. So this is a very interesting plant. Throughout the Mediterranean, from Israel and Jordan and Syria, all the way over to Spain and Portugal, these plants are fairly common both in the lowlands and in the mountains. They're called rock roses. Cistus is a Latin nominative. And as you can see, they have very beautiful flowers. I had large ones next to the driveway because the ones from the mountains can manage to live through the winter in Washington. Most of them would freeze to death. We saw a lot of them when we visited Israel. They're quite common there. And the plant, as you see, is these kind of rough corrugated evergreen leaves. It's quite pretty, but then it covers itself with these beautiful flowers in the spring. It's quite an extraordinary sight. And I started out using flowers exclusively in the first few months of my art until I sat down with Philip Brookman. Some of you know that Philip and Richard Mazer and I have been playing pool together for over 20 years. We're going to do it next week. And so Philip's a good friend. And most of you probably know that Philip is very distinguished in the photographic community. He was the chief curator at the Corcoran and is now one of the curators of photography at the National. And so he sat down and spent several hours with me, critiquing the work. It was very early on and giving me pointers. And, Philip is very, very quiet and understated. He gently said to me, I think you should branch out beyond flowers, because flowers was all I was doing. And you saw the barn and the karaoke cafe. I immediately took his advice. But I haven't given up on flowers. I do flower stuff practically every day because flowers are pretty all by themselves. And so it's not hard to allow them to yield further beauty. So that photograph was used to make this tapestry. So you see these little dots on the flower, and you see the sexual parts of the flower, the stamen and the male parts around it. There are the sexual parts of the flower, and there are the little dots, right? They've been rearranged, and I've modestly colorized it. I mean, it is colorized, obviously, because it's a white flower, but not heavily colorized. But what's extraordinary to me is this sort of looks like some fancy woven rug. This is a cultivated double clematis called Josephine. The previous flower, Cistus, if you went into one of the fancy nurseries around here, like Merrifield or Betty's Azalea Ranch or something like that, and you said, I'd like to buy a cistus, they'll say, oh, you've got a cyst, maybe you should go to the doctor. I mean, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. They'd never have heard of it. But you certainly can buy clematis. And if you have a garden, I'd urge everyone here who's looking, if possible, put at least one clematis in their garden. They're wonderful garden flowers. This was growing against the deck in the back of our house in Ellsworth Court. Every spring it would give me these beautiful flowers. And it's a wonderful subject because of its intrinsic beauty and complexity. So this reminded me, if you may remember, that when Alice was confronting the rather insane Queen of Hearts, that one of her assistants was sort of making comments to her. This reminds me of his face, but then I can transform things even much, much further. And there's probably been a little bit of colorization here, but mostly this is just moving all those pixels around, and suddenly you have something that looks like a fantastic piece of onyx. Many years after I started doing this, my brother was a highly trained fine artist, classical fine artist. He graduated art school with honors. He passed away a few years ago with Parkinson's, but he was the major influence on me in terms of me leading eventually into one career as an artist. And after I'd done this for a number of years, he said, why don't you try doing some things without a photograph? Just start with some simple color structure and see what you can do. So I sometimes do that, and that leads to often minimalist kind of art like this, which is very satisfying because it shows that using the very, very broad range of mathematical structures that is in my software, I can take even a very simple gradient and bit by bit create interesting, purely abstract structures from it. This is another example of starting from a very simple, probably gradient from blue to green, and then bit by bit injecting structures into it. I have quite a few pieces that remind me of Kandinsky, both his famous very early phase and his later phases. This is the later phases, the 30s and 40s. but it does look very Kandinsky-ish to me. And I also have many pieces that remind me of a very seminal piece in the history of art. I guess he called it Circles with Squares. It was one of the very first pieces in the history of modern art that was totally abstract. He just did a whole bunch of squares and did concentric circles in them. It startled the art world because it was so devoid of any connection to images of the real world. And I have a whole bunch of studies that echo that seminal piece by Kandinsky. I'm a member of the Foundry Gallery in Shaw in DC. I've been a member for 10 years. It's the second oldest artist cooperative in Washington. It was founded in 1973 by 4 female artists who were students of Gene Davis, one of the famous color field artists. That's the only famous art school from Washington. The last of them just died a few months ago. Gene Davis, some of his pieces hang in the Smithsonian museums. The color field people wanted to create color structures that were simple and completely devoid of any real world relationship. And so Gene Davis's tend to be stripes of colors. So working off of that, but wanting to be more complex, I've done a lot of pieces like this. So you can see it's a lot of verticals, but of course there are complex geometrical structures inside, which Gene Davis never would have done, but I regard it as sort of derivative of that school. Oftentimes when I put this up, I say to people, I'll go to the ATM and give you $100 in cash if you can guess what the original photograph was. I don't know if people want to take a minute and try to guess, they can, but I assure you I'm not going to take any trips to the ATM. No takers, okay. When Alana was in middle school and high school, she had a beat up old floor lamp, which sits behind me in the dark. You can't see it. Well, actually you can. If you look at that lamp sitting behind me right here, that's the starting photograph. It took a lot of transformations to get that lamp to this. Mathematics is pretty powerful. And I don't know where this came from. It did come from a photograph, I'm pretty sure of that, but I lost track of it. But it does look to me like some kind of alien train tracks. And I do self-portraits. Most of them tend to be like this, surreal. So I'm a man of two passions. Right on the left is science and the right is art, or you can take it the other way around. On the left is art and on the right is science.
Alan, I had one question. If someone asked you, like if you need 3 or 4 words to describe your art for an exhibit ad or something, what would you say?
If it was a small number of words, I would paraphrase a famous essay written by a Nobel Prize winner in physics, a man named Eugene Wigner. He was one of the brilliant physicists with Einstein and Schrodinger and all those people in Göttingen. He was Jewish, so he had to flee the Nazis too. He was a Hungarian Jew. And after the war, he wrote an essay called The Unreasonable Power of Mathematics in the Sciences. And what he was talking about is the fact that if you model physical systems, like relativity, right, with the proper equations, you can study those equations through many generations of human beings. And new insights into the world will keep dropping out of those simple symbols on a piece of paper, which is kind of magical. And so what I would say is, I'm looking to assert the unreasonable power of mathematics in the arts.
So, but if they asked you, like, is it photos, manipulation, computer? I mean, is
Oh,
there
what's it called? There is in fact an accepted technical name for what I'm doing. It's called generative art.
generative art?
It's a subcategory of digital art, and it's defined as art in which the artist sets up controls of equations and gives the computer some sort of graphical file to quote unquote paint on, but that the actual construction of the image is done by the computer, by the program that's executed, not by hand. Okay, so it's generating the image. So it's called generative art. That's what it is.
Thank you. This is just amazing what you do, Alan. And I hope AI doesn't take it over.
Well, it won't, for a number of reasons, but probably the most important one is I don't think anybody wants to do the work to completely remove the human from this. I mean, why would they do it? I mean, they're not going to make any money from it.
Got it.
It's too esoteric. I mean, it probably could be done. I don't know, maybe not yet, but eventually. Anyway,
Thank you.
I don't know if there are any other questions.
Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat. We've come to the end of our time, and I did want to make a comment, which is, it is really just so interesting how our artists express themselves and in the varied ways. And I was thinking that we all have ways that we express ourselves, and artistically too. You know, I'm a writer, and I was thinking we might have a program with different writers, how they write. But please think about it and let me know if there's some things you'd like to do in a program. You know, we all have artists in us. Thank you so much. And I just see the last comment from Beryl is she'd be interested to know what a photograph of a person's face might look like with just colorization, and if it would be interesting. But I'm going to leave that question for Alan to get back to Beryl about another time. And just thank everyone, and particular thanks to Alan, Rick, and Judy Beth for sharing their wonderful art with us, and to Elena for her efforts to make this work so beautifully. Thank you, everyone, and good night.